Welcome to episode 8, How a Story is Born, and Best Practices from Techcrunch's Anthony Ha.
Welcome to the PR Playbook podcast with Ranjini Joshua, the only podcast that teaches you how to strategically navigate the world of public relations and social media and grow a powerful brand.
Hello, and welcome to episode 8. Today, I get to re-interview Anthony Ha from Techcrunch. Anthony Ha is a senior writer at Techcrunch, where he covers media and advertising. He also writes Daily Crunch newsletter and co-hosts the Original Content podcast. This is my second time interviewing Anthony, and I'm really excited to have him on the PR Playbook podcast today. Hi, Anthony.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. I think every one of my podcasts over the last couple of weeks has started with the eternal question of how are you doing in the pandemic? So I think we all have the same level of, we're okay going on.
Yeah, I feel okay. I feel good. I'm home, working from home for the last maybe week and a half, and it's a little bit of an adjustment, but I'm getting used to it. I feel good I feel very mixed about the broader, bigger picture, but personally, I'm good.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. So today I wanted to address how a story is born, which I think is really important for any kind of company or brand who's doing PR to know. I planned this episode before everything in the news became a high focus on the current global pandemic. So how a story born today is a little bit different than usual. So I'd like to do something that's maybe along the mainstream. And then maybe also if you could touch on what's happening today and how you're seeing things pan out. But I think it's critical for brands, PR people and marketers, CEOs, entrepreneurs to really have an understanding of the editorial process. It's not about calling in favors, believe it or not. I've had many people ask me that. Or just publishing any kind of content. Everyone in the process has a job to do. So I'd really like to focus on the job of telling the story and it being something worth telling. I think that Techcrunch is arguably one of the media outlets that I work with or have to pitch the most since I'm in the tech startup space. So some people think it's just like me, pushing a magic button to get published. And even though I try to explain to them, and I've pitched Anthony quite a few times and it's not always that he says yes. So it's definitely a process. You have to know what people cover. And it's really important to know timeliness and when to pitch certain stories. So I have some more questions for you, Anthony, than I usually have of our typical guests, but we'll see what we can get through. And I think
I'm here for it. I'm ready.
Okay, pretty painless, hopefully. So if you could start by taking me through the process of when you first pick up a story and then begin writing it, that would be really great. Do your stories typically come from pitches or things and topics and ideas that you just want to report on?
Sure. Well, maybe one piece of context that might be helpful just to sort of give listeners a way to think about this is also just to keep in mind that Techcrunch in general is a very writer-driven organization, and we just publish a ton of stories. And so I think it's just important to remember that everything I'm about to say is Techcrunch specific and won't necessarily be true of a lot of other publications, especially more traditional publications.
Sure.
But in terms of process, it mostly is pitches that come in and probably a mix of embargoed stories and breaking news. But probably the things that I'm looking at the most are my inbox for pitches and then looking at Twitter and TechMeme and the TechCrunch chat room just to sort of see what else is breaking. And when I pick a story, if it's a breaking story, it tends to be very fast of just, okay, this is, Facebook has announced this thing. Apple has announced this thing. I will jump on this story now based on what information is already out there. I'll also try to do some reporting at the same time. But the gap between picking the story and it appearing on the site can be very, very fast, as little as, 15 minutes if it's a huge breaking story. Mm-hmm. In terms of pitches, it's more, I'm going through my inbox a couple times a day when I'm diligent. Sometimes if I get a little behind, it may just be once a day, but I will just, read through everything that seems to be a real genuine pitch and not just spam or, group, or like I have a huge, like I'm on some PR list, but rather anytime a real person has reached out to me with a real pitch, I'll try to read all of those. And essentially, I guess what I'm looking for there's like a number of different ways I can sort of think about stories, but at TechCrunch, there are things that we always cover, or not always cover, but they're the stories that are very clear-cut TechCrunch stories, whether it's a startup launch, a funding, M&A. Those are probably the big ones for us. Okay. And so those are the things where if I see that, I'll probably pay more attention. And then I may also then look for things that are maybe not completely in those categories, but seems interesting for some other reason. But I think there's sort of, in my head, I'm usually putting things into two different buckets: the clear TechCrunch news, and then the more of like a gray area. Well, then I guess the third bucket is just, this is obviously not something I would write about. And, and then, there, as there have been with you and I, there sometimes is a back and forth, but I tend to try to make decisions fairly quickly, because one of the things I don't like to do is, and have found, is that when if my instinct says no on a story, it's usually correct. Not necessarily for that's a bad story, but it's a bad story for me. Right. And so I tend to make these decisions fairly quickly. And then it proceeds. I would say the typical process then is we would set up an interview, maybe a remote demo, do that'll be, 30 minutes, 60 minutes. And then I write the story, and the story goes up on the site. So it's pretty straightforward. Yeah,
actually that you cut out my next question, but while you were talking, I had another question. So what is it that, if we have a limited time for you looking at your inbox, what is it that attracts you to the pitches in your inbox? I know you mentioned like maybe a direct contact, but let's say I'm writing a creative headline. Is it something that's like maybe the first of something, or is there some other angle that you really kind of usually pick up on?
I think that the most important thing for me is real clarity about what the news is. And so I don't, it's not that I'm discouraging creative headlines, but I think that that's a real risk of, at a certain point, it seems really funny or clever, and maybe I click on it, but I actually have no idea what you're pitching me. And then I have to read 5 paragraphs into the pitch to figure out what the heck is actually going on. And that at that point, I'm not particularly excited about looking at this story. It doesn't mean I'll definitely say no, but I don't actually think that's as helpful as just being very clear about, again, if we think about the things that are obvious TechCrunch stories, then you just want to state that out front of like, okay, if it's a funding story, say X startup, or, the startup in this space raises this much money, or raises from this investor, or something that just makes it clear about why that this is a news story, what the news is, and why I would be interested. And I mean, I think these pitches can be, varying in length. It doesn't necessarily, it can be just one paragraph of just, hey, this is what I'm pitching you. Are you interested? Right. You can include more information, but I think what I'm looking for is just in my head, what is the story? And that's what allows me to say yes or no. I mean, it's always a plus when it's somebody I know, or, it's about a company that I've, written about or think is interesting in some way previously. If the email is just written in a more human tone, I think that is certainly helpful, where it feels, again, like somebody took the time, and not necessarily like sucking up, but just to write a normal email, as opposed to I copy pasted the same email to 20 reporters. It's so funny that you say that, because there are some pitches that I, just from personal experience, this is probably going to put me in a weird spot now. But there are pitches that I've sent to you that I kind of know aren't really going to land, or may not be. And I kind of send it to you as almost like a just in case. And then there are ones that I think, oh, he'd be perfect. And they're a lot shorter. It's like literally like, hey, would you be interested in this? One sentence. And that's actually usually when I get a response from me. But I think even I have a good understanding of when that is and when that isn't. And sometimes I just feel compelled to send you some of the other pitches, because the client, they want you to reach out to certain people. And
And so it's easier for me to say like, oh, he didn't respond than to say, oh, to convince them that it wasn't worth sending to you in the first place.
And I think, and this is one where I think we're starting to get into very personal preferences. I think there are some reporters who would give you a completely different answer. For me personally, I am happy to get those pitches as long as that context is clear of, hey, I think this is a long shot. This isn't quite in your wheelhouse, or maybe don't have to be so direct as to say you're definitely not interested, but where it's just clear that you have some idea what I'm interested in and that this doesn't quite fit that. Right. Because then in the other situations where you are saying, hey, I really think this is for you, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to say yes, but it means I'm going to take it more seriously. And it's, that you have this credibility of knowing what I am and I'm not interested in.
Right. Yeah. No, it's really funny. Yeah. I think it's just such a weird dynamic, I think, between what PR people have to do and what they should be doing. And it kind of puts us in a tough spot when the client or, the company, they don't understand, like and for a lot of people, right? There's some people who don't know what they're doing. They clearly send bad pitches, but a lot of us have been doing this for a long time, and we'll tell them straightforward, like, no, this is probably not a good fit. But it's so crazy. Like sometimes they just don't heed that warning, and they want you to do whatever they want you to do.
Absolutely. And I know that's not an easy situation. I will say that certainly, and I would include you in this group, is I think the PR people who I pay the most attention to are the ones who I think don't simply do whatever the client tells them to do, but there's clearly some sense of pushback and trying to guide them in a more productive direction. Even though I understand at the end of the day, they're the ones who are paying you. But at the same time, there certainly I can think of PR people who it just seems clear that whatever insane thing the client asks them to do, they will do. And I don't blame them for that, but I'm not going to take their pitches very seriously.
Right. Well, that's I think that's good information for everybody. So you did cover about how long it typically takes you to finish a story, which sounds like it varies depending on what you write. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is a question I might have down later, but I would like to ask you now because I think it's relevant. If I'm not mistaken, you do write a couple feature stories every week, and then it sounds like you also do news. So about how many articles do you think you write every week? And I know you said Techcrunch is a kind of heavy article publishing site.
The last time I checked, it probably averages out to 10 posts a week. Okay. But I think, as you're sort of implying there, that encompasses a pretty broad range in terms of, I write the Daily Crunch newsletter, which is a pretty fast, more sort of aggregation or curation newsletter, where it's really just, here's 7 stories that I think from Techcrunch in the past day that you should read. And it's not a lot of editorializing, not a lot of writing. It's really just pulling that together. And that's 5 posts right there. And then, probably I've got somewhere between another 5, or if it's a really productive week, 10 stories, many of which are just going to be, a sort of run of the mill embargoed story or breaking news story. And then, like you said, I do occasionally do things that are features, which can mean a number of different things, whether it's a Q&A, a sort of trend piece, or an opinion piece, but those tend to be a lot more rare. There can be weeks where I don't write a single one of those.
Right. Okay. That I'm totally jumping around our question list. But since you mentioned embargoes, how much time, let's say I'm going to, launch something new product, or I'm actually maybe not a new product, I'm announcing funding. How much do you typically need for like lead time for something like that?
I would say that ideally I would get it at least 72 hours before the announcement. And basically, the more time, the better. And then especially once you get into just a day or two beforehand, it has to be the news has to be really, really appealing, because probably what's happening at that point, if it's just within a few days, is I'm probably going to have to either work extra hours to get this in or dump another story that I was planning to do. Mm-hmm. And so it has to be like a really impressive story. Otherwise, my default at that point is just to say no.
And is there any amount of time that's like too early?
I think for pitching, not really. What I found is, again, just for me personally, is I don't like to do interviews more than a week before the story runs, because it at that point, even though I like to think I take decent notes, it feels like you're sort of your memory, but the gap between a conversation or a demo or what have you and the writing can feel too long. And so you're like trying to, reconstruct something that happened that you don't remember very well. Whereas if we do it within a few days, I have a very fresh impression of what we talked about. And then I also have my notes.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds good. So then, okay, you've interviewed somebody, you've got your story down. What happens? And I feel like I've heard this from you before, and it is different from some of the other publications that we work with, how they go really closely through an editor on every step of the process. What is the process once you complete a story to when it publishes?
So the shortest, but also most accurate answer is as soon as I complete a story, I can hit publish and then it goes live on the site. Wow. There are copy editors who will go back and read stories that are on the site. And so you'll find sometimes people will catch typos and they'll email me and then I'll go in and the copy editor has already fixed it. But, certainly for a regular embargoed story, that's probably what would happen is I would write it, I would schedule it for the correct time, and then it would go up on the site. For something that is more in depth for whatever reason, say it's like a really big launch, you've provided additional access or something that makes it not your sort of run of the mill story, or it's going to be controversial in some way, then that's something I'm more likely to run by an editor, both a copy editor, just to make sure I didn't say anything that looks, that's going to be embarrassing in the story, but also just like dumb typos, or, I've done things where I've left the word million out of a funding story. And so it's like, they raised $5. That was not my finest moment. Yeah. And then also like usually either an editor or sometimes just a colleague who can read more for content and just say, well, this is clearly something you need to be asking. This is something you need to address. This is a better headline for the story. So there is editorial support when we want it, but for the most part, it's published straight to the site. Copy editor will clean it up a little bit within 30 to 60 minutes.
Wow, that's really cool. Actually, so what about we were talking a little bit about embargoes embargoes and exclusives are different. So we'll make sure we have the worksheet on the show notes so you guys know the difference between an exclusive and an embargo. But what about exclusives? Is that something you prefer or you like, you don't like? Does it deter you if somebody else has an exclusive to write a story?
Well, so I think there's a couple different ways that plays out. I mean, I'd say in general is exclusives for us are nice, but not necessary. And so in the case of a borderline story, it might make the difference. And then I think maybe even more than that is that if I know I've got the exclusive, I'm probably going to work a little extra harder to make sure that it's not, something I'm half-assing, but rather like really doing a good job on it. And asking the questions I need to ask and not necessarily just doing a flattering story, but at least that it's a story that I can feel really good about and defend anything that I put in there. And that also presumably nothing in it is going to be a huge surprise to you. So for some reason I decided that, this aspect of the product it sucks. Yeah. Then I should tell you that. I think I'm going to say, hey, like, just so you know, like this, when I was like trying it out, this didn't work. And I had some question about this. This is also going to be in the story. Just didn't want that to be a surprise. That rarely comes up, but I think that's some part of it is just, I'm going to spend a little bit more time making sure it's a good story. In terms of how that plays out with other publications, I feel it's certainly not a plus if I see that a publication has covered, certainly in the case of major news where if my editors think that Techcrunch is going to be poorer for not having it on the site, readers are going to be wondering why we didn't cover it, then we're going to suck it up and we're going to cover it anyway. Yeah. But it definitely does not make us excited to cover something. I think the other aspect of that is people sometimes with exclusives will try to over-engineer it, and they'll say, okay, like you've got the exclusive, 30 minutes before everyone else, or you've got this one exclusive piece of information that no one else has. And
That happens a lot.
I'm not saying that never works, but I think it very quickly turns into a situation where every journalist involved feels a little dirty, a little bit misled. And I don't think that's what you want from, a big announcement. You want all the journalists who covered it to be excited to be covering it, as opposed to at the end of it feel like it was a kind of a bad experience.
Yeah. And I've been through that maybe not many times, but a couple of times where, we were told to kind of position it a certain way just so we can get the coverage. And I agree. Like, you feel bad after that, even as for us specifically, right? Because we're trying to work with you guys on an ongoing basis. You feel bad. You don't want to trick anybody into covering you. But then also you're trying to make the client happy. So it's like a tough position for us, and it sucks for you because you don't want to have a bad feeling either. I feel like the days of like publicists versus journalists are kind of over for the most part.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think it's just, I think transparency is probably, is going to be the next step with the clients of, being transparent and then being able to receive that information of like, hey, this is how these journalists respond, and this is what we should be doing to make the most of the relationship. So I think things are going in that direction a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I would say also just that I'm much happier to get an email from somebody again who says, hey, we decided to give the exclusive on this funding to the Wall Street Journal. They've run the story, but we're still really interested in Techcrunch coverage. This is what we can offer you to make it a better story for you. Mm-hmm. I'd much rather get that than, hey, like, we're announcing funding, and then I go onto Google and realize that, a story has already run somewhere else.
Right. Absolutely. So I guess that's a good lead into the next question I have, which is, what are typically the materials that you're looking for? I spoke with someone, another journalist earlier this week, and she basically said like, hey, you know what? Don't hold the materials. If you're going to send me materials, just send me what you have so I can have it all in front of me. What is the most useful way for you to receive supportive materials for your articles?
I think the biggest thing for me is to have it all in one place. I mean, I understand why, because technically, not to get into like the mechanics unless you want to, and especially with an embargo, right? It's not, you shouldn't, if you want to do things properly, you shouldn't be sending embargoed materials until I've agreed to the embargo, because it's an agreement. And so if I haven't agreed, technically I could run it if anytime I wanted to, which usually I wouldn't do because that just isn't worth it. But other than that, what I mostly care about is just what can be frustrating is more when something got mentioned in this one email, something else got mentioned in this other email. The photos are spread across like 3 different email threads. So for me, it's about like when I'm writing, I can sit down and all the material is in one place. That's probably my biggest pet peeve I have is trying to piece together materials from a bunch of different emails.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, just from you saying that, I think we might incorporate a best practice of just having like one Google document that you can access everything from moving forward. Because it just seems like, okay, here are the links to everything you need would work a lot better than.
Mm-hmm. And I think that would be good too, in terms of, I know some certain things get updated. And so you may send me an image or a press release that isn't finalized. And, with especially if I have not necessarily allotted myself as much time to work on this as I should, and I'm in a rush, I have definitely used premature materials rather than the most up-to-date materials. So I think a Google Doc definitely could help alleviate some of that.
And is that like, okay, so one of the things a long time ago, back in the day when we used to pitch, you don't send attachments, and that was like a best practice. So what about in these days when, things can be spam or whatever, and obviously emails get really heavy. I mean, I think a lot of us have incorporated Google Docs into most of our emails. Is that a pretty good way to share information, links to Google Docs?
I mean, I think that it's good. I think the main thing you have to keep in mind is that that just because anything that you put behind in the Google Doc is something I'm not necessarily going to see before I make my decision. So whatever you're saying to convince me to write the story, it should be in the email itself. Because I've gotten emails where it's just like, hey, we're a cool startup. Check out this document. And then there's a link to a Google Drive. I'm not going to click on that.
They're asking you to work for something you don't even know you want.
Right, exactly. So I think for providing materials, either initially or as a follow-up, it's great. The email itself, though, it has to be the pitch that makes the case for you.
Okay, great. So I think another thing I have been trying to tap on and trying to get people to realize is that you have a job to do, and there are probably, very specific goals for each one of the things that you post. So what makes a story successful for you?
I think there's basically three answers to that I'll run through really quick. One is the most obvious one, which is just page views and traffic, right? If a story does really well traffic wise, it's very unlikely, I'm probably going to be happy with it. And it's very unlikely that an editor is going to yell at me about it. There are exceptions if it's like super controversial and it did really well because I said something stupid or made a really boneheaded mistake. But in general, that's the most obvious one. The second is that we're increasingly doing premium stories for Techcrunch, which is our subscription product. So the more those stories either turn people into subscribers or the more Techcrunch subscribers, people who are already Techcrunch subscribers are reading it, that's a success. And then I think the third is just if it's something that I or my editors are really happy with as a piece of writing or breaking important news, then we won't necessarily, there are stories where traffic wise, it doesn't do that well. It's not necessarily converting a lot of subscribers, but we just are really happy with it. We think we did a good job with it. And in those cases, I think that's also something that is, I think, a perfectly valid. If somebody says, why did you spend time on this? I could still just say, I think I did a really good job with it. It's a good story. The danger, the thing that I don't want to have happen is when it's a story that got no traffic and I didn't think I was very good, then I'm not necessarily very happy with my work and my bosses aren't necessarily happy with me.
Yeah, it kind of feels like it was a waste of time, right?
Exactly.
I mean, without being too blunt.
No, it sure does. It sure does.
Yeah. So the next few questions I have for you are a little bit more personal. And I really appreciate all the information you shared. I think this is a lot of information in a short amount of time. So my last question is a 3-parter. And actually, I'm going to ask you a question before that. So it's not my last. So my last question will be a 3-parter. My second to last question is, you had mentioned, which I think totally boggles my mind, that sometimes you only check your email once a day. If that's the case, when is the best time to send you an email?
So I should be clear. My email, even right now as we're speaking, is open. But in terms of going through and somewhat systematically trying to read every email,
right?
I try not to. I generally try to do it twice, basically at the beginning, at the end of the day. So with that in mind, the best time to reach me to get the top of my inbox is probably sometime between 6 and 9 a.m. Eastern, because I'll probably be checking it starting at 9. And so you'll get a response really quickly versus if you send me an email at the end of the day, especially I may have just checked my email. And so you may just be waiting the whole time.
Right.
Which again, I mean, my goal is to not do that. And especially if something seems urgent, to respond real quickly. It's not that I'm not sending any emails in that time, right. But in terms of there's a good chance that things can slip through the cracks if they're sent at that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, if I have some type of exclusive or embargo thing, I would probably rather send it to you around like 8:45 or 9. So you see it before you kind of tune into doing work for the day, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's not to say that I won't get back to you, or especially if you put like urgent exclusive or something in the subject line. I mean, I will definitely try to do that, but yeah, timing wise, that is probably the most reliable time. And of course, my hope is always that, that most of the things that come in, and then what turns out to be the case is most of the things that come in aren't necessarily that time sensitive.
Right.
And that if you're sending me an email that you need to hear back from me from in an hour, that is understandable, but not an ideal situation.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Not for anyone really.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last question I have is a 3-parter, finally. What is one thing you'd wish people wouldn't do when pitching you? One thing you wish they would do when pitching you, and your personal guilty pleasure?
Okay, let's see. We'll take this one by one. So one thing I wish people wouldn't do when pitching is, it's sort of a hard thing to describe, but it's actually pretty common, is this sort of expectation that my time isn't worth anything. And this thing of like, well, why can't you make the time to get on the phone with my client? Why can't you make the time to do this? Why can't you make the time to do that? And I think that most of the time, if you really think about it, again, if you look at how much I'm writing, which is not by far not the most at Techcrunch, the people who are writing a lot more, but compared to most reporters, it's a pretty high output.
Yeah.
I can't make the time to like get on the phone with every single interesting person who emails me. I can't write about every single interesting pitch that I get. And so just taking this tone of like, I don't, that of course you should make time for this, is something that kind of rubs me the wrong way. Ultimately, it's not going to be the thing that makes the difference in terms of what I decide to cover, but it does affect my opinion of the PR person.
Right. Okay.
And one thing I wish they would do, I think, is maybe just a reiteration of what I said before, just to be as clear as possible. Don't focus less on being creative or clever and more just on being as clear about the news as you can be. And my favorite guilty pleasure, I would say right now, at least, and it's not really a guilty pleasure, but something that I'm always have an uneasy relationship with the phrase guilty pleasure, because I'm not sure that we should ever feel that guilty about what we enjoy.
Right. Well, in today's landscape of mindfulness, we shouldn't feel too guilty. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that I am trying to do, because it makes me happy during this time, is I'm watching an episode of Star Trek, the original series, every day. And it is bringing me a great deal of joy.
Wow. Yeah, that's like nice. It's like something to look forward to at the end of the day.
Exactly. Yep.
That's cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the PR Playbook podcast and spend your time giving us tips so that we can be better equipped to pitch you. I feel like people can have a strong direction on how to approach the media in general after listening to kind of like the inner workings of the editorial process and things like that. So I felt like it was really important to share this information. So you can follow Anthony on Twitter at Anthony Ha, and send your best pitches to Anthony Ha at techcrunch.com. It's on his Twitter, so I have not divulged any secret information. And as usual, if you have questions, please send us comments, questions, suggestions to podcast@thesilvertelegram.com. If you want to run a pitch by us before you send it to Anthony, you can always send it to us as well. And you'll find additional show notes and information on Anthony in our Pitching Best Practices worksheet on the PR Playbook podcast main page. You'll also find the worksheet that gives you what an exclusive is versus an embargo, and some other resources that will help you pitch. If you want to submit a story idea for our review, again, we're happy to take a look at it and fine tune it. And that's all for now. Stay safe, healthy, and we can't wait to hear about your story idea. See you next week.
Bye. Thank you.